Hello and welcome to the sixth and final week of the Tolkien and the Gospel Summer Growth Series hosted by Church of the Redeemer in Greensboro, North Carolina. This video is part of a series of lectures and discussions about just a few of the ways that Tolkien's fantasy works can inform and shape our moral imaginations as Christians. My name is Hunter Van Wagenen, and this week we're going to discuss the topic of friendship. In our day and age, when words have so many different meanings and seem to shift their definitions relatively quickly, friendship is one of those terms, like love, whose meaning has gotten blurred. We refer to all kinds of different relationships as friendships, from drinking buddies to classmates, from digital social media profiles to lifelong committed friendships. I think today in 21st century America, friendship is something of a lost art. I know I particularly am not especially good at it. And yet friendship is incredibly important, and it's important that we understand what it is, because friendship is one of God's ways of revealing himself to the world and relating to the world. Friendship is actually part of God's salvation plan for us. So we do well to understand it and to cultivate it in our lives. Recall St. Paul's exhortation to the Philippians: whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. True friendship is an excellent and praiseworthy thing that has all too often been distorted in our Western world. Now, as we dive into what Scripture says about this admirable topic, I should say that I'm indebted to my friend Tommy Henson for helping shape my thinking about friendship. He's a priest in the D.C. area, which is a highly mobile city, and where people are often starved for friendship and true community. He says that there are 4 features of friendship that we see at work in Scripture. 1, identification. 2, openness. 3, love, and 4, commitment. Now, to flesh these features out, we're going to look first at David and Jonathan in the book of 1 Samuel. Immediately following David's defeat of the giant Goliath in a single combat where David showed his faith in God to deliver his people by challenging a seemingly invincible fighter, King Saul rewarded him by making him a general. But the prince Jonathan made him his friend, or rather God made Jonathan and David friends. So this is 1 Samuel 18, starting at verse 1. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic, and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Now, the wording here in the first verse is important. The NIV translates it, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, but the literal translation would be more like, Jonathan's soul was knitted to David's. Now, that tense is really important. It's passive person. So this is not Jonathan's own doing, and that leads to me to the important point about the first feature of friendship, which is identification. Jonathan and David really weren't out to find a friend. Their goal was the protection of Israel and the glory of God. So when Jonathan saw David's faith, he recognized a kindred spirit, but God was the one who drew them together. C.S. Lewis describes identification in his book, The Four Loves, in this way. The very condition of having friends is that we should want something else besides friends, where the truthful answer to the question, do you see the same truth, would be, I see nothing and I don't care about the truth. I only want a friend. No friendship can arise. There would be nothing for the friendship to be about, and friendship must be about something, even if it were only an enthusiasm for dominoes or white mice. Those who have nothing can share nothing. Those who are going nowhere can have no fellow travelers. In our longing for intimacy, it's often tempting to put the cart before the horse and to attempt to go around knitting our souls to other people. But friendship, for the sake of friendship, is not going to bring the blessing that true friendship will. Rather, true friendship occurs as a gift of providence when we are in the midst of following God's call on our lives. David and Jonathan are fulfilling their vocations, and God leads them to one another. And it's worth noting that this identification happens across a wide gap of social status. Jonathan, on the one hand, is next in line to the throne of Israel. David, on the other hand, is just a shepherd who emerges as a threat not only to Saul's authority, but actually to Jonathan's own inheritance. And yet, Jonathan takes off his cloak, his weapons and armor, and gives them to David. These are all symbols of his status and power. And he shows David that they are equals. He makes no distinction between the two of them based on rank. See, when deep identification happens, it cuts across political boundaries, age, class, education, all kinds of opinions. If identification is strong enough, friends can disagree and even get angry at each other about all kinds of things, and yet still live in a deep level of agreement. Now, the second feature of friendship we see at work here between Jonathan and David is openness. When Jonathan removes his symbols of status and power, he's literally taking off his armor. He makes himself vulnerable. And even though he's a manly warrior, there are many times when he weeps together with David because of all the times that Saul attempts to take David's life. Neither he or David have any shame in these tears. See, I think openness is one of the biggest barriers to true friendship today because it's hard with people you're going to see every day or every week. And yet it's extremely rewarding when you can find someone who will let you take your armor off and who will continue to live with you on a long-term basis. I would say to you, count yourself blessed if you have people in your life that you can be with, take your armor off, who will speak into your life and tell you when you may be doing something destructive or foolish, and who will face the worst parts of you without running for cover. Now, this sort of radical openness can really only happen with the next two features, which are love and commitment. Like I said at the beginning, love is another one of those words that gets thrown around so much these days that you have to explain what you mean almost every time you use it. As we see it in Jonathan and David's relationship, love is not just a nice feeling or a sentiment, though it includes good feelings and affection. You know, as I said, we see Jonathan and David weep together. We see them rejoice together. There's deep affection there. And when Jonathan eventually dies, David weeps and mourns and grieves, and he feels his death on a deep gut level. But love is also more than an emotion. It's also an action. It's the radical act of putting someone else's well-being up before your own. 1 Samuel 18:3 says, Jonathan loved David as his own soul. And for the sake of David's friendship, Jonathan defies his own father, Saul, time and again, while Saul is seeking to kill his rival, all while knowing that he himself is giving his birthright to be king after Saul. Now finally, friendship requires commitment. David and Jonathan make a great commitment to one another called a covenant. Now, the English translation of this passage says that they made a covenant, but the literal wording is much more helpful here. David and Jonathan cut a covenant. In the ancient Near East, it was common practice for two people, two rival kings or chieftains, two families or two friends, to take an animal, like a goat or a cow or a pigeon, and to cut it in half right down the middle. Or if they were really serious, they'd take maybe 2 or 3 animals. And the two members of the covenant would then place the two halves on the ground and walk between the two halves to symbolize that they were making an agreement. If I don't live up to my end of this commitment, then may what happened to this animal happen to me. Now, this kind of formal covenant or contract may not be necessary in our day and age, but in some cases, I would say maybe signing a letter or to one another wouldn't be a bad idea. See, I think a big reason true friendship is a lost art for us today is that we don't like commitment, because serious commitment to another person means a loss of my freedom. And I know in my case, I prefer to keep my options open for better offers. I like to see maybe someone who better fits my sensibilities is going to come along and want a spot on my calendar. Or maybe someone will come along who could help me gain the respect of others, or who could help me in my career. With those ends in mind, though, true friendship will actually lose out to mere utilitarianism, and you will be left wondering, are people using me the same way I'm using them? Remember, Jonathan wasn't looking for any kind of political alliance. He wasn't even looking for a remedy to his own loneliness. He was working toward a noble goal, in his case, the security of Israel and the glory of God, and he found a kindred spirit along the way. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this video that friendship is part of God's way of revealing himself to the world, a part of his way of relating to us. In John 15:14-15, Jesus actually calls his disciples friends. But actually, the first friendship between God and a man that the Bible explores is the friendship between Abraham and God. Throughout the story of Abraham's life, we see the four features of friendship at work. God identifies with him. In fact, he chooses to be identified with him as Abraham is tasked with blessing the nations. God is open with him, drawing Abraham into his decision-making process on whether he's going to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And he allows Abraham to ask questions and speak into that process. God loves Abraham, and he protects him from danger and battle, and he gives him a son. And God cuts a covenant with Abraham. This happens in Genesis 15, where God has Abraham take animals and cut them in half. And afterward, Abraham falls asleep, and he has a vision of God passing between the halves alone, while he, Abraham, merely watches from the side. And the meaning is clear. What God is saying is, if I, God, fail to live up to my end of the covenant, let what has happened to these animals happen to me. And if you, Abraham, or any of your descendants fail to live up to your end of the covenant, let what has happened to these animals happen to me. See, God takes that penalty risk for both parties of the covenant. And of course, as we read through the rest of the book of Genesis, we see that Abraham and his descendants do fail time and again. The entire nation of Israel fails to live up to its part of the covenant. And so, at the right time, God came to be one of us. He left the riches and glory of heaven to identify with us as human. And Jesus opened up God's heart to us by showing care for the poor, the orphan, the widow, the sick, and he taught his friends, the disciples, to do the same. He also opened up God's heart by revealing the intention behind the law. And as he says in John 15:15, I have called you friends, for everything that I learned from my Father, I have made known to you. He showed that he knows everything in the human heart. And therefore he showed us great love in healing the sick and feeding the hungry, raising the dead, and finally by dying a sinner's death in our place. And in that death he cuts a new covenant of friendship, not just with a person or a nation, but with all those who want to be a part of it. And no matter how many times we fail to live up to our end of the friendship, we have this comfort. Christ has paid the penalty for our fault. And he has made it possible to be friends with him no matter how many times we fail. I think all too often in our day, the spirit of the age convinces us that friendship is impossible without passing into romance. In previous generations, this used to be true in the case of friendship between the sexes, but more and more this fear of having desire or eros attributed to a relationship acts as a barrier between people regardless of their sex. And this is yet another reason why I think Tolkien's books can speak prophetically to our over-eroticized culture today, and they can help our imaginations prepare for the beauty and richness that true friendship can bring into our lives. So how do we see these four features of friendship, identification, openness, love, and commitment, play out in Tolkien's books? We're going to look at 4 examples: Gandalf and Bilbo, the Hobbits, Legolas and Gimli, and Frodo and Sam. So we first see identification that leads to friendship in all of Tolkien's works in this first chapter of The Hobbit, when Bilbo encounters the wizard Gandalf. When Bilbo recognizes who he is, despite the vast differences of experiences, of power, there is an immediate identification between them over something rather trivial, a love for fireworks. And that's what provides an opening for Gandalf to pursue friendship with this hobbit who is destined to go on an adventure. Even though Gandalf's choice of Bilbo puts the hobbit at great risk sometimes, we see that Gandalf does have true concern and love for him, and he goes to great lengths to convince the dwarves to keep him safe, even when he steals treasure from Thorin to help avoid a bloody conflict. We see, too, that Gandalf is willing to put up with complaining, and even towards the end, at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring, he even puts up with hostility from Bilbo. I'm thinking of the moment where Gandalf helps Bilbo give up the ring. It's a loving act, and yet Gandalf endures much hostility as a result. Now we see a similar sort of identification happening between Bilbo and Frodo and the younger hobbits. Merry and Pippin and Sam are all drawn to Bilbo and Frodo because they share a love of elves and poetry, of music and adventure. And even though there's actually quite a big age gap, and in the case of Sam there's also a class gap, these young hobbits become Bilbo's friends when many of his peers think he's a bit off. And in turn, Bilbo and Frodo are open with their young friends, even to the point that Frodo unwittingly reveals the nature of his quest to Merry and Pippin. But the younger hobbits' commitment is strong. They love Frodo so much that they challenge even Elrond at the prospect of being sent home rather than continuing into the face of unknown danger alongside Frodo, their friend. I would say Legolas and Gimli are probably the most extreme example of identification cutting across the normal boundaries between people. Among all the good races of Middle-earth, elves and dwarves have the most bad blood and history between them, and yet after their experience of combat and loss in Moria, and after their welcome from Lady Galadriel in Lothlorien, these two become brothers in arms, and they surprise the rest of the Fellowship with how close they become. And their affection for one another actually is so great that they become open to new experiences. Legolas goes with Gimli to see the caves of Helm's Deep after making a promise or a commitment, and Gimli is also willing to brave the fearful forest of Fangorn with Legolas. In fact, their friendship, we learned from the appendices, is so strong that Gimli is actually allowed to pass into the Undying Lands alongside Legolas, the only dwarf ever allowed to cross the ocean and pass into the west with the elves. And finally, we see identification between Frodo and Sam. At first, this identification is merely a love of elves and poetry, and that's what draws Sam especially to Frodo, because Frodo is noble in character and he loves a lot of the same things that Sam loves. But later they begin to connect even more deeply over the quest itself, and then finally when Sam becomes a bearer of the ring and begins to understand Frodo's burden, they connect and identify in a way that really only Gollum is able to alongside Frodo and Sam. Now, as far as openness goes, Sam's flaws are actually pretty apparent to anyone who reads the books or who encounters him, even though he's very wise and a lot of his wisdom is hidden. His weakness is a lack of intelligence, we might say. He's not as intelligent as the other characters, at least. And yet we also see that Sam bears with Frodo's weakness and even bears with some hostility from Frodo, similar to how Gandalf experiences with Bilbo, because when Sam is forced to take the ring from Frodo at the end of the Two Towers, when he returns it to Frodo, he faces Frodo's wrath. And of course, Sam makes a commitment to Frodo never to leave him. And it's that commitment that actually ends up seeing the quest to its completion. Now, for the sake of time, I'll stop with the examples. I could give so many more. I mean, it's these sort of surprising friendships are one of the driving factors in the Lord of the Rings series. Most of the dialogues, actually, at least the interesting ones, take place between surprising characters. I think of Gandalf and Pippin, or Merry and King Theoden, or Merry and Éowyn, or the two hobbits with Treebeard. I think of Strider with the four hobbits towards the beginning of the series. These different relationships develop characters in new ways. They help them grow. And in the end, friendship is one of the most powerful forces that keeps the quest going. So I hope in reading these books, your imagination can be primed to recognize, to nourish, and to thank God for friendship when you receive it. May all of us foster friendship with those whom God has placed in our lives. Now, to fit in this with this week's theme, our icebreaker question is, who is your favorite duo or trio in Tolkien's books? You could name any of the ones from this video, or perhaps there's another couple, or romantic couple, or a group of friends whose relationship you find especially engaging. Thank you for watching these videos, and to those of you who have taken part in the discussions, I've enjoyed them a lot. I've actually learned a lot from all of you, and I hope you are better able to recognize the healthy effects that good fantasy can have on your faith. As we close, let's remember St. Paul's words to the Philippians. Whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. May God bless you.